Good afternoon, everyone. This webinar today is about FileTrain. And more specifically, it's about taking charge of FileTrain. So what I'm hoping to cover are a number of more difficult, perhaps, topics in FileTrain and some tips and tricks to keep your FileTrain stations under control and not let the complexities of the workflow that you want to build get out of control. FileTrain. If you don't know what FileTrain is, then it's an automation tool. I'm not going to say too much more about it. What I will say is that there was an extensive introduction to FileTrain in a previous webinar about 2 weeks ago, I think, and that webinar has been posted online. So if you go to our support website, support.4ps.com, you'll find that webinar recording in the tutorial section. So if you want to review the basics of FileTrain, what it can be used for, and so on, then I would invite you to go watch that webinar recording, as that lays kind of the foundation for what we will be talking about today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the questions box you have available inside of your GoToWebinar control panel. That gives you the opportunity to ask what you want. I'll try to get to your question as I am talking, but in case I'm too busy or not good enough at multitasking to do that, I will come back to your specific questions at the end of the webinar. And of course, just fire off an email to one of us if you have something that you would like to discuss privately. Let's get going then. I have a little presentation here, and I'm not going to switch to presentation mode because I want to be able to go back and forth between the presentation and the FileTrain application itself. As you know, I like showing stuff in software much more than showing things in presentations. But these are roughly the topics I want to cover today. Something about sharing, a topic about debugging or figuring out what is wrong, something about macros and buckets, and those perhaps are the two most complex functionalities or features inside of FileTrain, and it's vital that you understand them. And then something about combining stations, and once we get to that point, I'll explain more about what that is. But let's start at the beginning and at sharing. It sounds like a very Christmassy topic, if you ask me, but it is very, very appropriate to FileTrain because it's one of the fundamental aspects of the application, and it is one of those things that can trip you up very easily. What am I referring to? Well, if we go to FileTrain itself, then as you know, there is a concept of a station, and a station is comparable to a workflow, if you want. It is a series of automated tasks that you want to run. Now, that is a station, but a station consists of a number of other building blocks. I have sources that define where the files come from, filters that define which files a particular action should be active on, and then I have actions that determine what will happen to a particular file. So if you want, those are all building blocks that are inside all of these stations that you see here. And the important concept to remember here is if I have two stations built in FileTrain, and of course they can be much more complex than what you see here, but in essence a station exists of a source, a filter, one or more filters actually, and then one or more actions that are connected to that filter. Well, if you look at these stations at its most basic, then it is very easy to share sources, filters, and actions between stations. In the example that you see on my screen, I have two stations that have a different source, but that use the same filter and that use the same action, and then the second action in both cases is different. And that is a very fundamental aspect in FileTrain. These things really are Lego blocks or building blocks, and sources, filters, and actions can be repurposed as many times as you want. There is actually a very easy way to see in FileTrain whether they are reused or not. And that is, if I go to configuration here, and then I select, for example, actions here at the bottom, then you can see that the list of actions consists of a name for each of these actions, the type of action that it is, but then it also says used in station. And you can see that some of these actions, the one I have selected, for example, are actually used in multiple stations. It's a very cool concept because it means that I can make a very complex action and I can simply reuse it in multiple workflows. It is also, of course, a dangerous concept if you are not aware of the fact that this is happening. And if we take this example again, you can see that I have two stations with a different source, so adjusting these sources would not be an issue, but they use the same filter and the same action afterwards. Now, if I open up action A in FileTrain and I change something to it, then you have to realize that all of a sudden you have modified station 1 and station 2 because that particular action is used in those different stations. So keep that in mind. It is a very useful feature and a very powerful feature, but keep in mind that while you're editing these things, you need to keep an eye on where they are used and whether this is actually what you want to do or not. And that kind of brings us to the second topic that I wanted to cover, and that is part of the debugging topic. There are a number of techniques that you can use to keep control over your FileTrain installation. And I found that naming conventions are actually a very important one. Now, I'm not going to force you to do anything, and FileTrain isn't forcing you to do anything either. But naming conventions can make your life much easier. If I go back to FileTrain for a second, and let me make this a little smaller and go to stations, you can see that I have a list of different stations in here. Now, first of all, I've given each of my stations a unique number at the beginning. Again, you're not obliged to do so, but I felt that was an easy way to keep them structured here. And if you look on the left-hand side of my screen at the folder that I created for FileTrain, then you'll see that I've actually used the same naming convention. And I can imagine that you want to do things slightly different in a production environment, so you might have to change this naming convention that is used here. But the idea behind what I did was to say, well, I have a station that has a unique ID, and I'm going to have a master folder for each station with that same unique ID. And if I open that, you'll see that all other folders are inside of that master folder. And that is the case for each of these folder structures that I have here. So basically, I have one station corresponding to one folder, and I make it easy to see which folder belongs to what station by using that unique ID. And then in that folder, I create the different subfolders that I need, like an input folder, in this case, an error output folder, and a folder for PNG images. I simply create those as subfolders inside that master folder in there. And that way, it's very easy to keep track where things are. But naming conventions can be useful for more than that. I said that you have stations, and then you have building blocks in those stations: sources, filters, and actions. And when I went to actions, you already saw that all of my actions, and let me filter those or sort them alphabetically for a second, all of my actions also follow a strict naming convention. They either have a unique ID in front of them, or they have the word generic in front of them. And the webinar ones that I have here are example actions that I created for various webinars. So I gave those a specific prefix as well. Now, that prefix, as you can imagine, refers back to the station. So if I look at my list of actions, I know that an action that begins with 0006 is going to be used in station number 6. So it was created specifically to be used in that particular station. Now, you can see that there are some exceptions. Naming conventions are very difficult to follow, but I tried to be very consistent about that. What you'll also see is that at the bottom, these generic actions typically are used in multiple stations. Those are actions that are so generic and are not based on the specifics of particular stations that I feel that I could easily reuse them in different stations. Let's take the example of this delete default file. If I open that one up, it's a simple delete action, and the only thing it does is it deletes the file that FileTrain picked up from its source. So this is something that you'll see coming up over and over again in the stations that you build. By calling this generic, I know that it is a generic action that I can safely reuse between different stations. But it also makes it clear when I'm editing actions and I see the word generic at the beginning of the name that I should take care, because very likely it's used in more than one place. So you don't want to break existing stations by editing those actions. So naming conventions, you do with them what you want in the end, but they can be very useful to apply. And believe me, the best thing that you can do is start using them early and then being very consistent as you build things. It's a lot more work to go into an existing FileTrain installation and start messing about with all of the actions afterwards and try to make things consistent afterwards. The best thing you can do is, as soon as you start building some test stations in there, simply think of the naming convention you want to use and then apply that consistently. So that's one point. It's a small point perhaps, but I would almost say if you remember and apply one thing from what I say during this webinar today, please think about this one, because it will save you lots of time. Now, of course, once you start building these stations, things don't always go well from the first try. That's unfortunately how this usually works. So having some debugging information, or in this case, logging information available, is very helpful. And if I go back to FileTrain and we go to the Preferences section, and I open that up, then you'll see that there are a number of folders that you can set here. The location of that temporary folder and the cache folder is perhaps less important, but the location of that log folder, because the log folder is so very useful, is very important. And by default, FileTrain puts it very close to this one here, so it puts it somewhere under library. And I find that annoying because it's difficult to find. So I moved that one. You can do so by simply saying browse. I moved that one to that same FileTrain folder that I have created in here. So these are all folders for stations, and then I have a special folder called resources with things like profiles in them, or database scripts and report templates and everything else that is more a resource if you want. And I have a special folder called logs. And let me open this folder actually, and I have it open here, and show you that in this log folder, I automatically get a subfolder for the date. And that will be saved for as many days as is stated here in FileTrain. So if I tell it to keep logs for 30 days, then I'll basically in this log folder always have 30 subfolders available. And if you want to figure out what happened on a particular day, the only thing you have to do is look at the folder for that day. Now, what FileTrain writes to that log folder is determined by the different stations. You can see that there is a separate file per station, and because these are still active logs, there is also a log file for each of these stations. But the content of those files is determined by this setting here. You can switch off logging if you want. I would not advise you to do so. But then you have different levels. Severe would mean that only the most severe error messages from FileTrain would be shown. And warning means that warning messages are shown as well. And the more you go to the bottom, the more information is going to be recorded by FileTrain. Now, if you have a production environment, you have a production system that has been set up and it works, and you're happy with what it does, then I would not set it to all, because there is a high volume of information logged to these logs, and that would slow down potentially the system. I would set it to, for example, info or warning, so that you're at least alerted if something goes wrong in your FileTrain system. If you're doing debugging or you're trying to build a workflow and figuring out how to do it exactly, I would strongly advise you to set this to all and get the maximum of information that you can get. And what do you get in that case? Well, I have a test station in here that we'll be using afterwards. But what you get is basically an HTML file. I could drag this on top of Safari or Chrome or Firefox, or in this case, I'll simply double-click, and it opens up in Safari. And that gives you a log of what has happened. And if nothing happens in your station, you basically see that FileTrain has scanned the input folders looking for files. And because typically in my test environment, that scanning is very frequent, you'll get a lot of that going on in here. What I'll do later is I'll process a file through some of these stations, and then we'll come back and see also how that looks in the log file. But you'll find a wealth of information in there about each file that is processed through FileTrain. So it's good to keep in mind that logging exists, and I would advise you to change the default folder for that logging to something that is a little bit easier to find, or make a shortcut to it somewhere if you prefer to do that. So logging can help if you're in a debug phase. What can also help is using text files, and it's a bit of a dirty trick perhaps, but it works very well. So let me go back to FileTrain and find one of those stations. So if I go to stations here, you'll see that I have one station running, and that's this thing called test station. I have a corresponding folder for that. If we look at what that does, well, I have an input source. That input source is this input folder I have here. And then I have a filter that processes all files. Very simple. I have a create test output action and a delete action. Delete is simply to remove the input file, and you can see that I used one of those generic delete actions for that. And the important action here is the create text file action. That is one of the actions available in FileTrain. You can give it a name, and you can fill out something here. And we'll make this a little bit more interesting as we go along, but for now I've just put some text in here, and I've selected an output folder and an output name in here. So let me close this up for a second. This is running, so what I can do is grab a file, drop it into the input folder, and it gives me some output. Now, the output it gives me is a text file, which is logical because we used this create text file action. And if I open up the text file, it says basically the text that I had in the action itself. So that create text file action allows me to create a text file and put whatever text I want in there. Now you can put fixed text in there, of course, which could be helpful to track where you are in a station, especially because if I go back to this action for a second, I have the ability to append. So rather than overwriting that text file each time this action happens, I can actually append to the end of that text file. And that would mean that I could use this action in multiple places in a complex station and simply write a marker that says we're now starting to do this or we're now starting to do that. But once we talk about buckets and macros, it will become much more interesting to use this text writing action. But for now, remember that we have this action, and it's probably the action I use the most when I'm trying to figure out why a particular station doesn't do what it's supposed to do, when I'm trying to create a difficult SQL statement to work with databases, or I don't know exactly what I'm getting back from a database, or I'm parsing XML files and I don't know exactly whether my XPath instruction is giving me the right result. All of those things can be helped by outputting information into a text file. It's very quick, and it gives you a very fast view on what the information in FileTrain is. So let me remove this one for now. So remember that you have that action. And before I end the debug topic, I want to show you two more perhaps details. First of all, any station that I select, I can say export. And when I export that station, it will give me, let me put that on my desktop, it will give me a FTD file, and that FTD file contains all of the information for that particular station in a simple file that I can now share with someone else, import in a different system, and so on. So that's an easy way to either make a backup or export something if you want to use it on a different machine or if you want to pass it on to someone else. But that's not the only thing you can do in FileTrain. And when we're talking about backups and so on, there is a much more useful feature. I can go to File, and then I have a backup and a restore menu item. That backup menu item, I can also save this on my desktop and then give it a name. I could say the date for today, for example, backup, and save that on my desktop. That backup action gives me another type of output file. But this time, FileTrain has put all of my stations and all of the other configuration that I have inside of that single file. And that means that I can now at will delete a bunch of these stations. I could change the rest of my setup that I have in here and do whatever I want to do. Whenever I would restore the old configuration, all of that information would be reset, and I have the same situation as I have today. So the backup and restore feature is a great feature if you're either trying to make a backup and make sure that you have everything that was embedded in FileTrain, or for example, if you're working on different projects and to work on project A, you only want the information that has to do with project A. This also can help to simply create a backup for project A and then have another one for project B. And because it's the full configuration, it's a simple import-export operation to have the full setup for these different projects. So keep those in mind when you're talking about testing and debugging and so on as well. There are two features that are supposed to be very difficult in FileTrain, and that are actually quite simple once you have them gotten explained to you in a simple enough way, or structured enough way, I should say. And let's begin with macros. When I open up the station and when I open up this text action again, you can see that the edit field that I have at the top here is white. It has a white background, while all of the other ones have a yellow background. Well, the yellow background means that you can run, or that you can use a macro inside of that particular edit field. What is a macro? Well, think about the formulas that you have in Excel, for example, where you can type something in an Excel, calculates whatever result of the formula that you typed there. Macros in FileTrain are the same type of instrument. It's a little bit of text that is interpreted by FileTrain and replaced by FileTrain each time it runs a station. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me give you the simplest example of a macro that I can find. And that is, for example, this. A macro in its simplest form always exists out of a percentage sign, the name of the macro, and this is case sensitive, so you want to type it exactly as it should be. We'll come back to the documentation in a bit. But so the name of the macro, which in this case is D, and then I have another percentage sign. This is the simplest form of the macro. And if I simply OK this one and I drop another file into my input folder and we go back to our text file, you can see that instead of having %d percentage in here, I now have today's date. And the format of the date is year, month, day. So that macro text that I had in that edit field has been replaced by FileTrain to whatever result that macro gives. In this case, it's the current date. Now, this is very nice, but of course, we may want to do other things. We may want to change the format of that date. It's a very common thing. And in order to support that, macros in many ways have different variants. That's how it's called in the documentation, different forms. And that is done by passing parameters to a macro. And how do I do that? Well, I have the same thing. I have a percentage sign, the name of that particular macro. And then I need square brackets. And in between those square brackets come my arguments or parameters that I pass in. And in this case, what I want is the date format in a way that looks more natural in Belgium, which would be, well, I would have the day, and then I would have the month, and then I would have the year. That would be more natural. So as you can see, I simply have the same macro, but now with square brackets, and then whatever the parameter is that I pass along. Notice that I don't have any spaces in here. I don't have any other parentheses or quotes or anything like that. All of that you don't need. You just need, in this particular instance, the format string that D macro supports. And if I enter that and I take another file and drop that in here, we'll get this. And this is still the same date, but now the date has been entered differently. So this is the second variant of that macro, and the second variant has a format string, and that format string determines which text you are going to see as a result. Now, some macros have multiple parameters, and the date macro is one of them. Instead of simply saying what format I want, I could also do this. And now I have two parameters. I have a +2, sorry, a comma, and then the format string that I want to use. And again, notice that I did not add spaces in here. And just to show that, let me do the same thing and add a space in front of here. And then what we'll do is OK this and OK that, and I'll take another file and drop that in here. You can see, by the way, that I did not have to stop and start that station. It simply took whatever new instructions I gave it and then put it in here. Now, if I would have remembered what file I took, it should be the one with the latest date. Now, this is the output I get now. Why? Well, because that second variant that I use now, the +2, is actually the number of days to add to current date, the date of today. And then that is shown. Thus, as today is the 23rd, actually the text I have here is the 25th, Christmas Day. Notice also the second form I have here. Because I have a space in my specification of here, my specification of that parameter that I pass to that macro, because I put a space in here, that space is actually simply output to the text file. So if you're working with macros, it's important to remember that in between these square brackets, you should have only the parameters that you want to pass to that macro and commas to separate the different parameters. If you add a space, FileTrain is going to assume that you mean to also use that space. And because we have a format string in here, it simply outputs a space, and then it outputs whatever format string we have put in here. It's an important point because very often, and I have the same, I do the same thing. Very often, you try to keep things legible by adding spaces in between stuff and making sure that you can easily read the macro that you've specified. But with macros and parameters in macros, you should be very careful when you're doing that, because in most cases that will simply be output as part of the macro, and that is not always what you want to do. Okay, so let me get back to my presentation for a second. So we have these macros, and as you saw, they have different forms that you can use. I already talked about the fact that they are case sensitive. Remember that. It's one of those other things that will bite you if you're not very careful. Don't use spaces unless you want to. And then, of course, documentation. The big question is, it's nice to know by heart that this thing means date, but where do I find that information? Well, let me clean up this thing here a little bit. Close this down. Now, where is the documentation? Well, I can go to FileTrain again, and I can go to the Help menu. And in the Help menu, there is something called Manual. And if I select that, I get the manual for FileTrain, and that includes things like how to configure stations and sources and filters and actions and so on. But at the very end, it contains a chapter on, or two chapters rather, on macros. The first one explains the syntax, and this is very much the same explanation as I have just done here. So this is information about the syntax itself. But the last chapter in here gives you a list of all of the macros that are available in FileTrain and how to use them. And you can see the D macro in here, for example. And if I click on that, you can see that I have the simple variant, and then I have one that takes simply a formatting string, and then the one that I used, which exists either with a plus or a minus for the number of days to add or subtract to the date that I'm working with. In many of these macros in the documentation, you'll also find examples, but like I said, if you have a station, if you configure one of your stations to simply output one of these text files, then that makes it very easy to experiment with macros and figure out what exactly they will do. This, again, can save you lots of time if you're trying to create a complex station and at some point in that station you want to insert a macro. Now, of course, I already used another macro in here as well, where you see file name. There is an F macro, and that macro gives me the name of the original file as it was picked up. And that's why when I put a PDF in here that was called halloweenbrochure.pdf, the name of the output text file I get is halloweenbrochure.text. You don't have to do this. I could just as well make this a fixed name. I could say, well, call this debug output.text, and then I'm going to have a fixed name in there as well. If you're trying to accomplish anything with FileTrain, it actually, I'm not a big fan of reading the whole documentation from start to end in most cases, but looking over the list of macros that you have available in FileTrain is a worthwhile investment of your time, because it will give you a rough idea of what the possibilities of the application are and what the different formats are that are supported in here, and that's useful. So I would take the time to read through this list and skim the short explanation, for example, for each of these. You can simply scroll down here, and that will give you that full list of all of the macros in here. So it's pretty easy to get that quick idea of what you have available here. So much for macros. Then moving on to the next bit, there is another topic that is hard to understand. And it's perhaps because it's pretty close to concepts that developers will also use in programming languages. And that is the concept of a bucket. FileTrain has something that is called a bucket. And well, explaining this is actually quite easy. You can see my very elaborate drawing here. A bucket is something that you can put something in. That's what you think of when you think of a bucket. You put water in there, you put something else in there. As long as there is no hole in the bucket, pun fully intended, it will stay in there until you take it out or put something else in there. That's the full concept in FileTrain. So whenever you hear about buckets, remember that it is something that can be used to hold information. In my example here, I have drawn a bucket, and I'm actually putting the number 42 in that bucket. Now, FileTrain works with stations and with files, and it will actually allow you to associate a bucket with a station or with a file. If I put this bucket in a station, that means that any file that is processed in that station, all the actions that act on those files could access that station bucket because it is attached to the station. If I attach it to a file, it means that that bucket is specific to a particular file. And so each file that moves through a station would have its own bucket that travels along with it, and where, again, I can put information in. Now, putting information in is not particularly useful by itself, of course, and that's the second big feature of buckets. You have to be able to get the information out again. So FileTrain has a way to let you make a bucket, and I'll give you a quick example of that in a second. It has a way to let you make a bucket, but of course it also has a way to let you get information out of a bucket. Well, that of course raises a question. What if I have multiple buckets? How does FileTrain know which bucket it has to take that information out of? Well, luckily, you can write names on buckets. And that means that if I have 3 buckets associated with a station, one is called Bob, the other one Matilda, and the other Leo, then I can tell FileTrain to take the number 42 and put it in the bucket called Bob. There you go. Now you know everything there is to know about buckets in FileTrain. And if the implementation seems a little bit more difficult than this at times, just think back to these 3 slides. A bucket is something to store information in. You can put something in, you can take it out. And because you can have multiple buckets, either on a station or on a file, you have to name them so that FileTrain knows which bucket you're referring to. That's it. Now, what does that mean in FileTrain itself? Let's take our test station to begin with. And let's say that I want to create a bucket in this test station. How would I do that? Well, if I open that station, there is this thing called bucket at the top here. So it would be a good guess to assume that it will be in there. And that's exactly what it is. This section here allows you to create station buckets, buckets that are attached to this particular station. Click the little plus to create it, and we had one called Bob and Matilda and so on. So let me call this one Matilda, and let's put some value in there. And to show you that it doesn't have to be a number, I'll put some text in there. Whatever you define here, whether it's a number, whether it's a date or text or whatever, it will simply be put in that bucket as text and stored in there. So I'm simply going to say, okay. And now if I go back to the station and I would go back to this bucket, you can see that it's still there. That's the concept of a bucket. Once you put it in there, it stays. So we're happy with that. Now, that's the putting in part. Now, how do we get it out? And of course, this station is ideal to test that because we have this create text output action in here. And instead of having this date macro in here, I'm going to use another macro. And because things don't always have to be difficult, the name of the macro is station bucket. And so station, you would assume that station bucket would get information out of a bucket associated with this station. Remember what I said? There can be multiple buckets, so I have to specify a name. Specifying a name in a macro is a parameter, which means I need square brackets, and then I need the name of that bucket, and that was Matilda. There you go. And what I could do to make it easier to understand is in bucket Matilda is, and then I have the macro. So everything that I have here, which is literal text, the whole beginning, will simply be output into that text file. And then this will be recognized as a macro, and it will be replaced by hopefully whatever value we have in the bucket called Matilda. And let's clean this up a little bit. And let's take a file, put it in my input folder, and see what the output gives. So in bucket Matilda is, penguins were here. As you can see, what FileTrain did is exactly what we expected. I asked it to use the macro called station bucket and give me the value that is in here in Matilda. And then it output that to the text file. Now, this is fine, but what I'm doing here is static initialization if you want. I create a station and I create a list of all of the station buckets that I want, and I put a value in there. Now, what if I want to change that value because a file comes in or something like that? We could try to use this bucket to remember the last file that was processed, for example. That seems like a worthwhile endeavor. How would we do that? Well, anything that happens in FileTrain really is an action that is executed. So to change a bucket value, to put something in one of those buckets, we need an action. We select a filter, go to actions, and then if I look through this list of actions, there is one called bucket. Open that. Let me be good as far as my naming convention is concerned. Store current file name in bucket Matilda. So that's the name, and then I have a choice. Now I can put something in a bucket called whatever I type here, but a bucket attached to an object, or I could store something in a bucket attached to a station. I need a station bucket, of course, and I want the bucket called Matilda. Before we go there, however, let me add another one. So I can use this action to store multiple things. What if I now would create a bucket called Bob? If I put Bob here, I'm asking FileTrain to put something in that bucket, but I haven't created that bucket yet. So what happens? Well, FileTrain is simply going to create that station bucket right here for you. So if you add things in the list, you can add as many as you want. If the bucket already exists, then that new value that you pass is simply going to put in there. If the bucket doesn't exist yet on the station level, then FileTrain is simply going to create that for you. And that's the same way you would associate something with an object, a file or a folder as well. You would switch this to object bucket, and then you would give it a name and a value, and FileTrain would automatically create an object bucket for you. But we want a station bucket, and we want one that is called Matilda, and the value we want to put in there is the name of the last file that was processed. So actually the file that we're processing right here. And we've already seen how to do that. There is a %f macro in here that I can use, and that's actually the name of that file. So let me OK that. Now that was put at the very end of the list. What I want to do is I want to do this before I have the text output. So the first thing that's going to happen is that the name of my file is going to be stored in that bucket, and then the next thing that happens is this text output for debugging reasons. And let me clean up again so that we're sure of what is happening here. take a file and put that in there, and it will give me some outputs. So the file I dropped in was called valentine.pdf. What my text file now contains is, in bucket Matilda, is Valentine. So it saved that name of the file. There is no extension because the F macro only takes the name. There is an E macro that you can use to also have the extension of that file if that's what you want. But in that bucket, it did indeed store the name of the file it was processing. So I now have a station bucket that always has the name of the file that we are processing. Now, wait a minute. I have the station here, and now we've done stuff to it. So I still have this here. So see that this is remembered? Even though it was an action that put something in my station bucket, of course, once it's in the bucket, it stays in the bucket. So if I open up the station dialog here and I go looking at which of these station buckets I have and what is in them, I again see the name of that file that was just processed. So information that you store in there remains in there until you either delete the bucket or you put something else in. Now, just to show you that that's not a nonsense concept, let me take this file, and it actually has a generic action in here that does something with buckets. If I go to bucket for this station, you can see that there is a bucket here that is called unique station number. Its value is 20 at the moment. And if I open up this bucket action, well, what we see is already a little bit more complex than a simple macro. But basically, if I look at this part here, that's exactly what we just did. So this gives me the current value that is stored inside that station bucket. And then I have a math macro around it that basically does a +1. And then it stores this whole result back into the bucket. So what this does, if you try to visualize it, is I have a bucket and there is a number in that bucket. I take the number out, I add 1, and then I put it back in the bucket. So each time this action is executed, it looks at that bucket and simply increments the value that is in there. And then if you look at the next action, that will actually use that value that is in my bucket to give a unique prefix to each file that is processed by that station. Okay, so that's the bucket concept for you. And of course, I've done this demo with station buckets, but file buckets work in exactly the same way, except that they're not stored together with the station, but they're stored together with each file that is being processed through a station. Now, then there is a last topic that I want to talk about, and that has to do with stations. You can see that I have a list here of different stations, and if you start building your own stations, you'll see that it is sometimes difficult to figure out how to do things in one station. And there are a number of techniques that you can use that make this easier. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at this station, for example, it's called create cropped PNG images. What I want to do here is I want to run an action that is, takes a PDF file, trims that PDF file into trims off all the white space from that PDF file if you want, and then rasterizes that PDF file. And all of that happens with PDF Toolbox. But that's a number of different actions that I want to do. And so the question is, how do you implement that? Well, if you start building workflows like that, you'll notice that the easiest way to solve that is to have very simple stations. Very simple stations, and with that I mean stations such as this one. I have an input source, and then I have an action, and I move my original file to an originals folder. That's it. That's all that happens. Now, if I have three different actions that I want to do, it becomes a little bit more difficult, because these actions, if you remember what I talked about last time, these actions in FileTrain always operate on the original file. It's not the case that an action generates a result and then that result is the input of the next action. No, these actions that you have here always operate on the original file. That's why you have a pre-flight action here that moves the output file to a specific location, and that's why I have a move to output original action here that moves that original file that came in from my source to a specific subfolder, right? Now, if I want to run three different actions, and each of them should be run on the result of the preceding one, then the easiest way to do that is by creating three different stations. Station 1 has an output folder, Station 2 picks up files from that output folder and does something with them, and then Station 3 picks up files from the output folder of Station 2. You create kind of a cascade, if you want, where each station generates the result that is picked up by the next station. What I find annoying about that is that even though it's a very simple setup, you need multiple stations for a particular action. And that can be cumbersome because the amount of actions, the amount of stations, if you want, explodes. There are a number of things that you can do to make that better. And one of the things that you can do here is take this station as an example. One of the things that you can do is play with naming conventions. And if you first look at this station, it will feel totally wrong. But that is because what I do here is use a naming convention for the files that are processed, and I process them through different filters. And let's see if I can show you what happens. You'll have to be quick. But if I go to station number 8, and I take a file and I put that in input, watch what happens carefully to that input file. Well, not much is going to happen if I don't switch the station on, of course. There we go. Watch the file now. So it renames it to rasterized in front of it. And it's renamed it again to trimmed. And now it's created a PNG file, and that PNG file is moved to the PNG images folder. So I have done a number of actions. What I have done is, first of all, I have rasterized the file. I have then trimmed it to trim away all the white space around it. And I have then taken that and created a PNG file. Now the question is, how did I do that? And to understand what happened here, you have to kind of read this thing from the bottom up almost. I took a file called purplepenguin.pdf, and I've thrown that in the input source here. Well, the first thing it encounters is a filter. And that filter says PDF files beginning with rasterized. I can show you what it does. It's exactly what the label says. This filter only takes up files that begin with the word rasterized. This filter says, I can't use you because you don't have rasterized in front. It moves to the next filter, which only processes files called trimmed. And that's not the case either. So it moves to this filter, and this filter says, well, basically, if you're a PDF document, I'm happy and I'll take you. This filter has an action attached that says rasterize this file, and this actually uses a command line for PDF Toolbox to rasterize the document. And the key in here, and you can forget all the rest of the command line for now, but the key in here is that it has this, it adds this prefix to the name of the output. So I have my Purple Penguin PDF coming in. The output file will be named rasterized, and then it has the original file name following it. And that file is put in the same source folder. So it's put simply inside of input. That's why you saw that file appear in there. And that means that FileTrain thinks there is a new file. And now it does have the word rasterized in front of it, so it's taken up by this filter. And in that case, it goes to the crop with PDF Toolbox action. And that action adds the word trimmed in the beginning of the file name. And so the next time it appears, FileTrain moves it to this particular filter, and this one finally generates a PNG file. The PNG file is also created in the input folder, but then it's moved by this other filter here. So by playing with naming conventions of your files that you're processing, and by counting on the fact that FileTrain will see a file and will present it to the different filters you have defined in a station, up to the moment where it encounters a filter that says, hey, I want this one, you can actually combine multiple actions into one station and get away with that. And in the end, the result is that I've done 3 different operations: rasterization, trimming, and conversion to PNG. And I've done it in one station using only 3 folders: input, output, and an error folder if something goes wrong. So it's a powerful technique. Remember that it is possible. Like I said, we're recording this webinar, so you'll be able to watch this again afterwards. And I'll also share this example station with you so that you can see what that technique was again. Now, there's 2 other things that you can do that allow you sometimes to combine different things together. And I'll try not to take too long to explain because I'm already talking an hour, but it will take another 5 minutes, I think. This is another station where I don't have different actions, but I have different sources. And so the question is there a way to have the station look at these different sources and process all of the PDF files that come out of these different sources, but process them slightly differently? And it turns out there is. If you put a filter in here that says all PDF files, then that filter will automatically get all files that are dropped in the input Mac or input PC input source. Everything goes into that filter. Everything goes to this particular action. And what you see here are 2 actions that show how to deal with those different input sources. And if I look at the copy action first, then you can see that instead of doing a simple copy, I have a folder where the file needs to be copied to, and then I have a subfolder that needs to be created. And that subfolder is created based on the source name. Again, look at that list of macros that exist because it's very, very useful to know what is there. And you'll find that there is a macro called case, and that works like an if then else if you want. What case does is it allows you to say, well, I have a condition, the first part of the macro, and then if that condition is true, I want to do this thing. If the condition is false, I want to do this thing. And what is the condition in my case? Well, the condition here is that I compare the source name, and that's a macro that gives me the name of the source. So basically, this name that you see here. And I say, well, if that source name equals 0013 input Mac, the top one I have here, then create a subfolder called copy Mac. If it doesn't, create a subfolder called copy PC. So even though the files can come in from different input sources and are processed by the same copy action, they will still be put in different subfolders in the end because I examine that source name and do something different. And the same technique is used here, but instead of using a case, I've used another macro because I know what the input, the source names are here, and I know that both of them start with a number and then have a hyphen and then a common part. So what I've done here is say, well, take everything in this source name, starting with position 13, character 13, which happens to be somewhere in here, probably the M or the P, depending on which source you're talking about. And then I don't have anything at the end. So take that till the last character and then simply use that. So this action will either create a subfolder called Mac or a subfolder called PC, and then put the job in there. Again, one station with multiple input sources, but a different action. So the 2 things we've seen here are a little bit different. In this first one that I ran, I had a station that has one input source, but multiple actions that you want to do. And you saw the file being renamed and being processed in the same folder. This one is different in the sense that we have one or a series of actions that we want to do, but we want to take into account where that file comes from. And it shows you that you can do that. And as a closing one, I actually have a nicer variant even of that same station, where instead of having this case or substring or whatever and making the whole thing a little bit more complex in that sense, what I've done is I've added a filter to begin with that processes all files. So everything that is put into any input source in here will be moved through this action. And what this action does is it uses the same source name macro, and it puts that into a object bucket called source name. So we basically simply save the value of the source name into that bucket. We put that in there. And now I have created a filter that looks at that bucket. And so this is a filter that says if there is an object bucket, and if that object bucket with name source name contains the word Mac, and this can be case sensitive or case insensitive. In my example, it's case insensitive. So if that bucket contains the word Mac, then I want to handle this file. So each action I put after this filter will only be executed if the original file was dropped into the Mac input source. And the same on the PC side. Of course, here I look at the same object bucket, but I compare it to the word PC. And so these actions will only be executed on files that come out of that input PC source. Okay. Going back to the presentation, that's the last slide. I put this slide in here so that you can reference that afterwards as well. Like I said, I will be more than happy to share also the stations that show these different techniques on how you can simplify things or put some things together. I will share it with you as well. Let me maybe end by saying that these are techniques that I find easier. I find it easier to have one station that does a whole bunch of things rather than having 5 stations that do a part of the job. But that is totally up to you. If you feel more comfortable by not using one of these more advanced techniques, if you want, and splitting things up in multiple stations, then of course you're free to do so. You should do whatever feels more natural to you. Just remember to do something that is structured. Think about how you name things and how that will work, and make something from the very beginning that you think will survive the more complex workflows you are undoubtedly going to want to build with FileTrain at some point. That brings me to the end of this webinar. If you have any questions, then I would invite you to enter those questions into the questions box now. It might also be that it was too much advanced information and you want to review this webinar. Like I said, the recording will be made available. You'll get an email with the link to it once it's up on our website. But that's what I wanted to share with you. There is one more FileTrain webinar that we have scheduled. That's next week. So if you feel like a little distraction just before preparing for the New Year's parties, I will be happy to see you back on next Tuesday, I believe it also is, at 4 p.m. And what we will be doing in that session is we will be looking at 2 advanced stations, and we will look at them in some detail. First of all, a station that will give you pre-flight statistics. So it will use PDF Toolbox to pre-flight files, and then it will put information about that pre-flight in a database that can then be shown on a website. That's one of the stations that we'll be looking at. And then the second one I want to look at with you is an exclusive preview, if you want, where we'll be using XML input files, getting information out of a database, and we'll be using a new tool that Callas is creating that will be available in January. That tool is called PDF Chip, and it can create PDF files on the fly, good PDF files on the fly. So you could use this to, for example, such as in this example workflow, create business cards that are PDFX compliant and use spot colors and hit all the right spots when you're in a pre-press workflow. So these two stations go into a little bit more depth. They talk about databases, they talk about XML, they talk about PDF Toolbox and PDF Chip, and we'll be examining what they do and how you can use some of those same techniques in your workflows. Okay, I can see no questions, which is good. I'm assuming that that is because everything was clear and not because all of you are sleeping by now. If you have any questions afterwards, don't hesitate to send me a quick email. You can reach me on my email address, or you can use support@4ps.com or info@4ps.com. All of those will end up with us, and we'll be more than happy to help you with that. Have a great day.